He bought a place everyone avoided. Rust, silence, and something that shouldn't be there. Some stories don't fade. They wait. Like the video, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Ethan Carter stood in front of the county administration building long enough for the cold to seep through the soles of his boots and into his bones. The structure behind him was low, square, and tired, much like the town itself. Peeling paint clung stubbornly to the concrete walls, and a faded American flag hung limp above the entrance, barely moving in the wind that rolled in from the open plains. Great Falls lay miles away, but its shadow never quite reached this place. This town existed in the space between highways, between decades, between relevance and forgetting. The folder in Ethan's hands was thin, too thin for something that was supposed to change a man's life. Cheap paper, a few stamps, signatures that meant more to the county than they ever would to him. Still, those pages declared one simple fact. The abandoned Cold War-era storage depot on the eastern edge of town now belonged to him. He had paid less for it than he once had for a used pickup that barely lasted a winter. The low price should have felt like a victory. Instead, it sat in his chest like a weight he hadn't yet decided whether to carry or drop. Ethan was 42, tall, broad-shouldered, with the posture of someone who had spent years learning how to stand still under pressure. His hair was cut short out of habit rather than care, already thinning at the temples. His face carried sharp lines that never softened, as if it had forgotten how. People often said he looked calm. They were wrong. He was controlled, which was something entirely different. The Marine Corps had taught him that much before it taught him anything else. After his discharge, life had not fallen apart dramatically. There had been no single moment of collapse. Instead, it thinned out. Jobs came and went. Warehouses, construction sites, seasonal work that demanded strength, but no questions. He rented rooms he never personalized, slept on mattresses that weren't his, and moved on before anyone bothered to learn more than his first name. He didn't talk about the war, not because he was hiding something, but because the words never seemed useful. The past didn't need retelling. It lived where it belonged, behind his eyes and under his skin. The town knew who he was without knowing him, the quiet veteran, the drifter who stayed longer than expected. They nodded when they passed him, asked about the weather, never about his life. When the news spread that Ethan had bought the old depot, the nods turned into smirks. "You buy that place?" someone asked him outside the grocery store the day after the sale became public. "Yeah," Ethan answered. "You know it's junk, right?" "Most things are." Laughter followed him down the street. Others were less subtle. They talked about rats, about asbestos, about ghosts left over from government projects that were better off buried. One man told him the building was cursed, said people disappeared around it in the 90s. Ethan listened, said nothing. He had learned long ago that mockery often masked relief. If the town could laugh at his choice, it didn't have to wonder why the building still stood untouched after all these years. The depot sat where the pavement ended and dirt took over. A long gravel road led to it, flanked by tall, dry grass and rusted fence posts leaning at tired angles. From a distance, the building looked like an animal that had laid down and never gotten back up. Sections of the roof sagged inward. The steel doors were warped, one hanging lower than the other, their surfaces blistered with rust. Cracks ran through the concrete walls in irregular patterns, some patched decades ago, others left to widen on their own. Ethan visited for the first time in daylight. He walked the perimeter slowly, boots crunching on gravel and broken glass. He noticed things most people wouldn't have. The way certain walls were thicker than necessary. The uneven texture of the concrete floor, visible through gaps in the doors, as if it had been poured in stages rather than once. old mounting brackets bolted into the walls where no equipment remained. None of it proved anything. Together, though, it suggested intention. He pushed one of the doors open just enough to step inside. The air hit him immediately, heavy with the smell of oil, dust, and damp metal. It was a smell he recognized, one that belonged to work and storage and time passing without care. His footsteps echoed farther than expected, the sound lingering as if the space were larger than it appeared from outside. Light filtered through holes in the roof, falling in pale columns that revealed hanging chains, broken pallets, and the skeletal remains of shelving units. Ethan stood still, letting his eyes adjust. He felt it then, subtle but undeniable. The sense that the building wasn't empty, even though it was. Not presence in the way people meant when they spoke of ghosts, but something structural, embedded. The depot felt heavier on the inside, as if it carried a purpose it had never fully let go of. He walked deeper, running a hand along the wall. The concrete was cold and rough beneath his fingers. In places, the surface changed abruptly, smoother, denser, reinforced. He noted it without comment, the way he had been trained to notice terrain before stepping forward. When he finally left, the sun was already beginning to dip, stretching long shadows across the grass. That night, lying on the narrow bed in his rented room, Ethan stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind rattle the window frame. He thought about the depot, about the way it had been altered, about why no one had ever bothered to tear it down despite years of neglect. The town called it worthless. The county had sold it like a mistake they were happy to erase. But buildings, like people, were rarely that simple. By morning, his decision felt less like curiosity and more like resolve. He didn't know yet what he was looking for, only that he wasn't ready to walk away. Ethan returned to the depot after sunset, when the town had settled into its familiar quiet, and the last vehicles on the highway had thinned to distant, passing sounds. The sky above the plains was clear and cold, stars sharp and indifferent. He parked his truck well away from the building and walked the remaining distance, boots brushing through tall grass that whispered softly around his legs. The depot loomed larger at night, its dark shape absorbing what little light the moon offered. Inside, the air felt different than it had during the day. Cooler, heavier. The wind found its way through cracks in the walls and broken sections of the roof, moving through the space with a low, uneven sigh. Somewhere deeper within, metal tapped gently against metal, a slow, irregular sound that repeated just often enough to draw attention without revealing its source. Ethan paused just inside the doorway and listened. His breathing remained steady, his pulse controlled. This was not fear. It was focus. He switched on his flashlight and let the beam cut through the darkness. Dust drifted through the light like fine ash. Shadows stretched and shifted along the walls as he moved, distorting the shapes of old equipment and debris. The depot no longer felt like an abandoned workplace. It felt like a structure that had been closed deliberately, left to decay on the surface, while something beneath it remained unchanged. As he moved farther in, details began to stand out more clearly. The walls along the northern side were noticeably thicker, their edges uneven where newer concrete met older material. The floor dipped and rose subtly, the texture changing from smooth to coarse and back again in irregular patches. Ethan knelt and ran his fingers along one section. Different pour. Different time. He straightened slowly, eyes narrowing. Several interior doors lined one corridor, each reinforced with heavy industrial locks, far larger than necessary for a civilian storage site. Some were rusted shut, others hung slightly open, revealing nothing but empty rooms beyond. Still, their presence bothered him. Locks like these were meant to keep people out, not pests in. He continued deeper, careful with each step. The echo of his boots followed him, delayed by a fraction of a second, as if the space were measuring him before responding. In the far corner of the depot, partially hidden behind collapsed shelving and rotted pallets, something caught his attention. The arrangement was too neat. Boards stacked evenly, pallets aligned, dust disturbed less than the surrounding areas. Abandonment was messy. This was not. Ethan approached slowly. He crouched and pressed down on one of the boards. It didn't shift. He knocked against it with his knuckles. The sound that answered was dull and solid, lacking the hollow echo he would have expected. He tried another spot, then another. The result was the same. Whatever lay beneath those boards was not empty space. A familiar tension settled into his shoulders. It was the same sensation he had felt before patrols, before entering buildings that looked quiet, but weren't. His mind began sorting possibilities without conscious effort. Reinforced walls, altered flooring, oversized locks, careful concealment. None of it belonged to a forgotten county depot. He didn't remove the boards. Not yet. Instead, he stood and slowly scanned the surrounding area, noting angles, lines of sight, places where shadows gathered more thickly. He imagined the building as it once was, active, purposeful, people moving with intent rather than routine. The image felt uncomfortably easy to picture. After several minutes, Ethan stepped back and turned off his flashlight. Darkness reclaimed the space instantly, broken only by faint moonlight slipping through the damaged roof. He stood there, letting his eyes adjust, letting the building exist without interference. The metallic tapping sound continued somewhere behind him, steady and patient. He resisted the urge to track it down. Some things revealed themselves more clearly when left alone. When he finally left the depot, he replaced the door as carefully as he could, leaving it as he had found it. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant water. He walked back to his truck without looking over his shoulder. That night, sleep came slowly. Ethan lay awake, replaying the layout of the depot in his mind, mapping walls and corners, estimating distances. He thought about the boards, about the sound beneath them, about the fact that no one in town had ever mentioned renovations or reinforcements, about how easily a place could hide a second purpose beneath a first. By morning, his course of action was clear. He would return in daylight. He would clear debris properly, methodically. No rushing, no assumptions. Whatever the depot had been, it had been built by people who valued control. Ethan intended to respect that, even as he prepared to uncover what they had left behind. Ethan arrived just after sunrise, when the light was still thin and gray, spreading slowly across the plains, as if reluctant to wake the land. The town remained quiet behind him. He preferred it that way. The depot stood unchanged, its silhouette sharp against the pale sky, waiting with the same patient stillness it had shown the night before. He began with order. Not because the place demanded it, but because he did. Ethan cleared debris methodically, dragging broken pallets aside, stacking warped boards away from the walls, separating metal scraps from rotted wood. Each movement was deliberate, economical. He worked the way he had been trained, conserving energy, observing as he went. Dust rose in clouds, clinging to his jacket and skin, coating the air with the dry taste of neglect. As the floor slowly emerged from beneath layers of decay, the irregularities became impossible to ignore. Sections of concrete differed in color and texture, some smoother, others rougher. The seams between them faint but visible. These were not cracks formed by time. They were boundaries, lines drawn by intent. Ethan paused, studying them, then continued clearing until he reached the far corner where the boards lay hidden. Up close in daylight, the concealment was even more obvious. The boards were thicker than the others, darker with age, but better preserved. They fit together tightly, edges aligned with care. He knelt and pressed his weight against them again. No give. No creak. He reached for the pry bar he had brought with him and tested the edge of one board. It resisted, then shifted with reluctant protest. Beneath the wood was metal. Not thin sheet metal, not something improvised. This was solid, industrial, its surface cold even through his gloves. Ethan cleared the remaining boards until the full outline revealed itself. A reinforced steel blast hatch, rectangular, set flush with the floor. A dried rubber seal traced its perimeter. At the center sat a locking mechanism thick with rust, but unmistakably designed for strength rather than convenience. Ethan stood there for a long moment, breathing slowly. He had seen doors like this before, though never in a place like this. Not in a county depot. Not hidden under layers of civilian neglect. His hand hovered over the latch, then withdrew. He forced himself to step back and reassess. Curiosity without caution had a way of killing people. He checked the surrounding area once more, then returned to the hatch. This time, he engaged the mechanism. The lock resisted at first, metal grinding against metal, then gave way with a sharp, echoing crack that rang through the depot. Ethan winced instinctively, listening for any response beyond the settling groan of the building. Nothing followed. He pulled, and the hatch lifted slowly, releasing a breath of air from below that smelled of damp concrete, oil, and something older. Underground. A narrow stairwell descended into darkness. The steps were concrete, worn smooth in the center, edges chipped from years of use. This had not been opened recently. That much was clear. Ethan switched on his flashlight and began his descent, one hand brushing the wall for balance. With each step, the air grew cooler, heavier. Sounds from above faded until only his breathing and the faint drip of water somewhere below remained. The stairwell ended in a large chamber. Ethan stepped off the final stair and swept his light across the room. The beam revealed rows of metal shelving lining the walls, many bent under their own weight but still standing. Wooden crates sat stacked in uneven columns, their markings faded, but legible enough to recognize as military. Helmets lay piled in one corner, paint flaking, dents frozen into their surfaces like memories. Nearby, long crates held disassembled rifles, their wooden stocks dried and cracked, metal parts preserved better by the cold. This was no forgotten junk pile. It was a cache, organized, cataloged, maintained until it had been deliberately sealed away. Ethan moved slowly, absorbing the scope of it. Sealed containers bore stenciled numbers and warning symbols. Canvas-wrapped bundles rested where someone had placed them with care. He felt a tightening in his chest, not from fear, but from recognition. He knew this language, this order. This was how things were stored when they mattered. On a low table near the back of the chamber, something smaller caught his eye. A metal trunk, set apart from the rest, its surface rusted but intact. The lock was stiff but functional. Ethan knelt and opened it. Inside lay a leather-bound field journal, its cover cracked and worn at the edges. He lifted it gently, as if it might break apart in his hands. The first page bore a name written in firm, disciplined handwriting. Major Daniel Hargrove. Below it, dates, unit identifiers, logistics codes. The early entries were sparse, precise, devoid of emotion. Inventory movements, storage transfers, equipment classifications. Ethan flipped through the pages slowly. As the journal progressed, the writing changed. Paragraphs grew longer, margins filled with notes, words pressed closer together, as if the author were running out of time or space. Hargrove wrote of a program that never received a proper name. It was referred to only by designation, by numbers that meant nothing on their own. As the Cold War drew to a close, orders came down to dismantle, destroy, erase. Materials were to be disposed of, records wiped clean. According to the journal, Hargrove had refused. He documented his decision without drama. Destroying the materials, he wrote, would not serve security. It would serve convenience. Ethan closed the journal slowly. The weight of it felt disproportionate to its size. This underground chamber was not an accident. It was a choice. Someone had decided that certain things should survive even if the system that created them did not. He stood and looked around the chamber again. In the silence, he felt a strange alignment, as if the space recognized him as much as he recognized it. He had spent years feeling discarded, unnecessary, part of a past the world wanted to forget. Standing there, surrounded by objects preserved against that very impulse, something inside him shifted. Ethan replaced the journal in the trunk and closed it carefully. He did not take anything with him when he left. Instead, he ascended the stairs, lowered the hatch back into place, and recovered it with the boards as best he could. The depot above felt different now, heavier, but also clearer. It was no longer just a building. It was a responsibility. When he stepped back into the daylight, the sun was higher, the plain stretching wide and indifferent around him. Ethan took a long breath. He knew, with quiet certainty, that whatever had been buried here had waited a long time to be found. And now that it had, nothing would remain the same. At first, Ethan thought the change was in his head. After what he had seen beneath the depot, it would have been easy to imagine threats where none existed. But patterns had a way of announcing themselves to those who knew how to look, and Ethan had learned long ago to trust repetition more than instinct alone. The first sign came the morning after his second descent underground. As he drove toward town, he noticed a dark pickup parked along the shoulder of the road, leading out of the fields. The engine was off. No plates on the rear bumper. Inside, a single figure sat motionless, hands on the wheel, eyes forward. The truck did not follow him, did not move at all, but the awareness of it clung to Ethan long after it disappeared in his rearview mirror. Later that day, he found fresh tire tracks near the depot. Not his. The marks curved close to the structure, then turned back toward the road. Whoever had driven there hadn't stayed long. Long enough to look. Long enough to confirm something. In town, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations stopped when he entered the diner. People who once ignored him now watched too carefully. Questions came wrapped in casual tones that didn't fit their timing. What was he planning to do with the building? Had he found anything useful? Was the place worth fixing up after all? Ethan answered simply, always the same way. He was cleaning it out. Just junk. Old junk. That night, he opened Hargrove's journal again, this time reading with different eyes. What had once seemed like distant paranoia now felt uncomfortably precise. Hargrove wrote about visits from men who did not identify themselves properly, about offers of assistance that carried the weight of expectation. He referred to them as hunters of the past, people who saw history not as memory, but as inventory. According to the journal, they arrived whenever something valuable resurfaced, offering protection in exchange for access, silence in exchange for compliance. Ethan closed the journal and sat in the quiet of his rented room, listening to the building settle around him. The truth settled with it. The depot was no longer just a secret. It was a signal, and signals attracted attention. The weather report that evening mentioned a strong system moving in from the west, high winds, heavy rain, possible flooding. The plains had a way of turning storms into something personal. Ethan drove back to the depot before dark, intending only to check the structure. He didn't need long to see the damage accelerating. Water seeped through cracks in the roof, dripping steadily onto the concrete floor. One of the interior beams groaned under its own weight, the sound deep and strained. The building had been dying slowly for decades. Now it seemed eager to finish the process. Standing there, surrounded by rust and water, Ethan understood that time was no longer neutral. The underground chamber was protected, but not invulnerable. If the storm hit hard enough, the stairwell would flood. Paper would rot. Metal would corrode. Whatever Hargrove had preserved would be lost not to erasure, but to neglect. The choice pressed in on him from both sides. He could report the discovery, turn everything over to authorities, and watch it disappear behind sealed doors and official statements. Or he could do nothing and let the storm erase it completely. Both options felt like surrender. Ethan returned home and spread the journal across the small kitchen table. He read until the words blurred, until the past and present braided together in his mind. Hargrove had been offered a way out, according to the final entries. A chance to hand over responsibility and walk away safely. He had refused, not out of heroism, but out of clarity. Some things, once relinquished, could not be reclaimed. Late that night, Ethan heard a vehicle slow outside, tires on gravel, an engine idling just long enough to be noticed. He did not look out the window. He did not reach for a phone. He sat still, counting his breaths, letting the moment pass, the way he had learned to let danger pass when confrontation was not yet necessary. By morning, his decision was made. He returned to the depot before dawn, the sky low and colorless. He worked quickly but carefully, lowering himself into the underground chamber and selecting only what could be carried without drawing attention. The journal went first, sealed in plastic and tucked into his pack. He chose a handful of document folders with intact markings, heavy enough to matter, but light enough to move fast. From the shelves, he took only a few mechanical components, compact pieces that suggested function without revealing scale. He did not clear the chamber. He did not empty it. He took just enough to preserve proof without exposing the whole. Each trip upstairs tightened the sense of urgency. The wind was already rising, rattling the loose metal above him. Clouds gathered low over the plains, darkening the horizon. As he replaced the boards over the hatch one final time, Ethan paused. He rested his hand on the concrete floor, feeling the vibration of the building responding to the weather. He had the distinct impression of standing at the edge of something that could no longer be contained. The past was awake now, and like any force brought back into motion, it demanded a reckoning. When he stepped outside, the first drops of rain struck the dust at his feet, darkening it instantly. The storm was closer than the forecast had promised. Ethan loaded the last of the salvaged items into his truck and pulled away, the depot receding behind him as the sky lowered and the wind began to howl. Whatever was coming next, it would not wait much longer. The storm arrived without ceremony, as if it had been waiting for permission and finally decided it no longer needed it. Wind tore across the plains in violent bursts, bending the tall grass flat against the earth. Rain followed in heavy sheets, driven sideways, striking buildings with enough force to sound like thrown gravel. By the time darkness fully settled, the power lines were already down, the town swallowed by a silence broken only by the howl of the wind. Ethan did not sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed, fully dressed, boots on, listening as the structure around him creaked and complained. He knew this kind of night, not the weather itself, but the feeling of inevitability that came with it. When conditions reached a certain point, hesitation became the most dangerous choice. He left just after midnight. The road to the depot had turned treacherous, mud forming where dust had been hours earlier. His truck swayed under the force of the wind, headlights carving narrow tunnels through rain and debris. Fallen branches littered the roadside. Somewhere in the distance, metal screamed as something gave way. Ethan's hand stayed steady on the wheel. Fear wasted energy. Focus preserved it. When the depot came into view, his chest tightened. The roof shuddered under the storm's assault, sections lifting and slamming back down with hollow booms. One of the steel doors had torn partially free, banging rhythmically against the frame. Water poured through every weakness the building had ever developed, and several it had not known it possessed. Inside, the sound was overwhelming. Rain hammered the floor, pooled water sloshing with each gust of wind. Beams groaned overhead, the noise deep and strained, the sound of material reaching its limit. Ethan did not linger. He moved straight to the concealed corner and tore away the boards, with no concern for subtlety. The hatch was slick with moisture, rust streaks bleeding down its surface. He forced it open and was met with a rush of cold, damp air. The stairwell below was already wet, water streaming down the steps like a shallow river. He descended without pause, gripping the wall as his boot slipped. The underground chamber echoed with chaos. Shelving rocked, crates shifted. Somewhere metal crashed to the floor with a sound that vibrated through the concrete. The water was rising. Ethan moved fast now, abandoning careful selection. He went straight for the metal trunk and pulled it free, cradling it against his chest. He grabbed the sealed document packs he had prepared earlier, then hesitated for half a second before seizing one compact crate of mechanical parts. The weight dragged at him, but he welcomed it. It gave his movement urgency, clarity. Above him, something snapped. The sound was unmistakable. Structural failure. A warning with no room for debate. Water surged higher, soaking his pants, numbing his legs. He turned for the stairs just as part of a shelf collapsed behind him, sending debris crashing into the rising pool. He climbed hard, muscles burning, lungs pulling in air thick with damp and dust. The chamber shook, concrete shedding small fragments that rattled down the steps. Ethan reached the top and hauled himself through the hatch just as a deep, concussive boom rolled up from below. He slammed the hatch closed and stumbled back as the floor beneath it sagged inward. Cracks raced outward like fractures in ice. He didn't try to secure the boards. There was no time. He ran. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet as he staggered toward the exit, rain blinding him, debris striking his shoulders and back. Just as he cleared the doorway, the sound came again, louder this time. The roof finally gave in. Steel screamed. Concrete shattered. The center of the depot collapsed inward in a thunderous cascade, swallowing the underground chamber whole. Ethan fell to his knees outside, clutching the trunk and packs, breath tearing from his chest in ragged pulls. Behind him, the building continued to fail, pieces breaking away and crashing down until nothing remained but a twisted, sinking ruin. The storm did not pause to acknowledge the destruction. It simply moved on, dragging rain and wind across the plains as if nothing of consequence had occurred. By morning, the world looked stripped bare. Snow mixed with the last of the rain, falling lightly now, almost gently. Steam rose from the wreckage as the first weak sunlight filtered through thinning clouds. Where the depot had stood, there was only debris, water pooling among broken beams and shattered concrete. People arrived later, county officials, a few deputies, locals drawn by curiosity and the promise of spectacle. They walked the perimeter, peered into the ruin, shook their heads. There was nothing to recover. Whatever lay beneath was buried beyond reach, crushed and flooded. Some looked disappointed, others relieved. Ethan answered questions briefly. Old building, bad storm, structural failure. Every word was true, even if it wasn't complete. He left before noon. In Great Falls, he rented a small concrete garage on the edge of an industrial strip, a place overlooked by newer developments and ignored by most. There, in the quiet, he laid out what he had saved: the journal, the documents, the few surviving components. He cleaned them carefully, methodically, not as trophies, but as responsibilities. In the evenings, he began to write. Not reports, not accusations. He wrote about people, about service, about the quiet choices made when no one was watching, about men like Daniel Hargrove, who refused to let memory be erased for convenience, and about himself, though never directly. He wrote so the past would not become merchandise, not be reduced to numbers and price tags. He did not grow wealthy. No one interviewed him. His name did not appear in print. But something else took root, a steadiness he had not known in years, purpose, earned rather than assigned. Sometimes he drove back out to where the depot had been. Grass had already begun to push through the wreckage. Rust spread. Time resumed its work. Ethan stood there quietly, hands in his pockets, feeling no urge to interfere. Some things were meant to return to the ground. Others were meant to be carried forward. And for the first time since leaving the service, Ethan understood exactly which burden was his to bear. Not every truth is meant to be exposed. Some are meant to be protected. If this story stayed with you, like the video, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from.